Hi, my name is Ina and I am a trainer and mentor with the Kilby Increase, or KI for short. So KI is a revolutionary cutting-edge self-inquiry process that goes to the root of suffering, emotional repression. And because of my background, I get often asked how the Kilby Increase compare to other modalities that I've trained in. And I wanted to share with you a sliver of my story to provide an answer from my own direct experience. So more than 12 years ago, a perfect storm became the catalyst for my healing journey. So my health crashed because of violent autoimmune reactions. I left my job that I was completely identified with in France. I became a mother and I moved from Europe to Canada. So everything in my life was uprooted. At the time, I had no idea what this healing journey entailed, and nor did I understand then how much my unconscious mind was actually creating the very suffering that I wanted to escape. What I do remember is that I wanted to feel anything other than pain, or what I used to call the great numbness. I was hiding my struggles behind a frozen smile on my face because I so desperately wanted to be seen as kind, reliable, strong, and without any needs, without being a burden to anyone. So along my path, I learned many things that provided me a sense of joy, a sense of aliveness, and some big symptoms disappeared, but yet suffering continued in various ways. So here I wanted to share something with you that I wished someone had shared with me with my 12-year younger self. So many therapeutic or personal development modalities claim to guide people beyond coping and managing symptoms. However, in the last few years, I've learned that even when the work feels transformational, without skillfully addressing emotional repression, it misses the mark and it fails to get to the root of suffering and create lasting change. So what is emotional repression and how are the Kilby Increase different? So I describe emotional repression as a built-in, super intelligent and innocent survival mechanism that we adopt as children to stay connected to our primary caregivers and to survive situations that feel overwhelming. However, left unchecked and unconscious, this repression mechanism gets wrapped up in our identity and it will drive our suffering until we bring it into conscious awareness. So repression forces us to behave and condition patterns that many mistake as personality traits, while in fact it is an unconscious trauma adaptation on autopilot. Our nervous system tends to default to emotions that it has learned to perceive as safer, or it shuts down entirely, which is also an unconscious safety mechanism. This disconnection from our authentic emotions and ourselves leads to strained relationships, a sense of isolation, and it impacts all areas of our lives. To give an example from my own life, my programming related to repressed sadness and hurt includes a command, I have to be responsible, which prevented me from experiencing joy and relaxation for decades. It also led to a compulsion to work and to take charge for as long as I remember. And the repression of anger and hurt prevented me from establishing healthy boundaries, leading to burnout, migraines, and autoimmune problems. So this is also a great segue into explaining the difference between KI and other modalities that I studied before. So these modalities focus primarily on identity, limiting beliefs, deficiency stories, shadows, along with associated emotions that were just beneath the surface of our consciousness. What is key is that none addressed the missing experience in our present awareness or the contractions in our body. So I never connected the dots that those contractions were actually pockets of frozen fear that were trapping buried emotions. So it's true what many say, in order to heal, you need to feel. But what most don't know is that emotional repression doesn't show up as a feeling. It shows up as a contraction. You can't simply feel what you buried long time ago. You need tools, skills, and support. And so without targeting the actual repression programming and skillfully dissolving those contractions in your body that contain the buried emotions, they remain missing in your experience, and the repression mechanism itself stays intact. I've also found that recovering emotions that were previously stuck in contractions obsoleted the need for nervous system regulation, and that makes just so much sense because all of our emotions are key tools of the nervous system that regulates itself then. So the Kiloby inquiries provide tools and a language to dive underneath those identities, making unconscious programming conscious by aligning mind and body, and that reverses repression programs to then access, feel, and express emotions that were locked a long time ago. So for me, this work has been a tremendous gift of freedom that just keeps giving, because there's nothing more freeing than the freedom to be myself. My programming still kicks in at times and tries to keep me safe, but with the tools and support, I've learned to use every piece of suffering to gain more freedom, and so can you.
You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I've got a really great guest today. Her name is Ina Bakbir. She's a mentor at Kiloby. This is hard to pronounce. Kiloby. Kiloby. We're going to talk about debunking mindfulness and talking about deep breathing. Deep breathing is the solution to anger and all kinds of other psychological tips and tools that Ina's had to develop over her life to be able to, function well in the world. I think you'll really like her story and you'll enjoy hearing from her. So welcome, Ina. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, my name is Ina.
Well, Ina.
So, though I'm used to being called Ina when I lived in Canada.
Yeah, it was funny for the audience. I asked Ina for that pronunciation of everything except their first name, so I thought I had it, and I'm like, oh, well.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Well, tell me a bit about your background, and then we'll get into the topic.
Well, my background is all over the place. Like I lived in quite a few different countries in the world, but I started my career in creative problem solving and innovation management and worked in the car industry in Munich. And I moved from project controls to procurement management and project management at international organizations. I even had diplomatic status in my last project. I worked until 2013 when my health crashed. Then basically, a perfect storm around, it was 2011, 12. Yes, almost 13 years ago, became a catalyst for my own healing quest. My health crashed first. I had several autoimmune reactions, urticarial vasculitis. Then I left that job that I was completely identified with. I became a mother in that time, moved to Canada from Europe, and lots of things happened in that time. And so that actually saved my life. So my body
What saved your life? Was it the trauma saved your life? The physical problem saved you?
Actually, what I didn't realize at the time is I needed this stop. My body was screaming at me because the patterns that I had relentlessly working nonstop. I was a complete workaholic. I was proud of the fact that I never slept. I was carrying it as a badge of honor that I only needed like 3-4 hours of sleep at night and I could going. I was proud of the fact that I was, in a very high profile leadership job at a very young age as a woman, in a male dominated research and development environment. And I was able to, what is it? I was thinking about the English expression.
What is the English expression, by the way?
I was thinking like you needed to have really thick skin to be able to stand your man in that environment. I don't know. Do you say it that way?
Well, thick skin, yeah. The people that are attacked, or you need to have that when you're in an environment where you're maybe one of the only women, and all the guys are kind of maybe looking at you as maybe less competent, or who knows.
Yeah, well, I was basically negotiating agreements in an international environment, often between many parties, involved many millions of dollars.
Oh,
And
that's no
so,
big deal. People do that all the time.
yeah. And
No wonder
I
why
was
you felt
only,
like that.
and I was only 28 at a time, right? It was in greenfield project management. The project was basically an agreement between several world parties. The US were involved, and Europe with many countries, and Russia, South Korea, Japan, India. And, I was in the middle of that. I'd always felt like I was in a fighter jet ready to push the button to, in case I would crash, I would just fly out, right? So
Were you
uh,
proud of yourself on all the things that you were able to accomplish back then, even though they were stressful?
I was very proud, and I loved my job. And I also realized in many ways that I was repeating my childhood, which was and that is only I realized afterwards when I dove into trauma and into anger management and emotional repression work, is that I was really good at managing crisis. And that's a skill that I learned from childhood, growing up in a childhood home that was very unpredictable, very, violent at times, a lot of crises to manage. And I was the oldest daughter with three younger brothers. And I just kept in this state of high vigilance, even though I loved the job. And so my nervous system, was basically constantly dysregulated. I would wake up with crises in Japan, and I would go to bed, teleconferencing with companies on the West Coast in the US, and, the domestic agency in Tennessee. So there was always crisis going on, which mimicked my childhood.
Yeah, I guess you were, probably when you were a parent too, maybe you were like a rescue parent. And I don't know, maybe did it come out then? Or, I know you don't have to speak about that, but
Yeah, it was kind of funny because the joke that I, mentioned a lot after quitting my job was it was easier to manage a portfolio of $2 billion than managing two kids.
oh, wow.
Yeah. So, in the end, what happened at the time was also that I fell into this place where I sometimes refer to as the great numbness. And I had this facade of always being strong and hiding my struggles behind a frozen smile, wanting to be seen as kind or reliable and not be a burden. But so when I got really sick, I needed to have this, I needed help to recover. And that's when I really hit a wall, because I spent my life chasing freedom, or what I thought was freedom, but actually that was driven by the repression of hurt and a fair bit of buried anger. So that is what I got to learn, that an KI, emotional repression increase, so Kiloby increase, which is the modality that I basically left all other psychotherapeutic modalities that I learned before behind. What I found out is I had a lot of programming in my body that show up as hyper-independent, and that shows up as traits that society applaud, like perfectionism, academic success, career, self-sufficiency, resourcefulness. But in the end, it's just programming in the body that says, leave me alone, and I have to be alone. And so just to rewind a bit, I studied different modalities when I got really sick, and I struggled in my relationship with my husband back then. I first became a holistic nutritionist and studied nutrition, and that was my first line of learning. I did a lot of modalities like homeopathy and part of naturopathic medicine courses. But then I got in touch with Gabor Mate and a lot of his trauma work, and studied transpersonal psychology. And basically what I found when I was studying intergenerational trauma is that my health fell apart at the exact age when my mother's health fell apart. And I got curious, is it just genes, or is there some pattern in trauma that we are repeating? And I found that it was patterns that we are repeating. And a lot of things shifted for me back then. A lot of things shifted, but then still I was able to, feel more emotions, because one of the main things that I struggled with at the time, was that I felt very robotic, as if, and I felt a lot of shame around that, like especially with my children. I felt shame around not being able to feel deep love for them. I felt shame and guilt, that I wasn't able to be playful with my kids. I struggled with that. And that didn't shift at the time. And what I learned, like in early 21, 22, when I came across emotional repression inquiry, what I learned is that though I did do a lot of healing work, what was missing in all those healing modalities is the missing experience. So I want to explain that a little bit. I was mostly showing up as shutdown, or I could be angry. But what I wasn't able to feel was hurt and sad. And so what happens when we repress emotions as children is that we resort to emotions that feel safe for the nervous system. So emotional repression, I would like to dive into that a little bit more and then use myself as an example here.
Well, quick analysis. I mean, it's my armchair analysis. I'm no psychologist, but it just sounds like you weren't allowed to be anything but like a fixer. Even from the time you were a kid, you had to help your family, and you said it was uncertain, and you were hypervigilant. So, and then at your job too, you were constantly fixing. So I guess that's why you repressed everything. Is you just had to be on all the time and fix everything, and you couldn't allow yourself to be you.
Exactly. I didn't know what that would even meant to be me. So because from early childhood, like me, and I've been working with hundreds of clients, emotional repression is a mechanism that is built in. It's intelligence. It's a survival system that we adopt as children. We hold back our authentic emotions in order to stay connected to our primary caregivers. And we survive situations that feel overwhelming. And you can see it, everywhere around you. When children have a tantrum, we teach them to be quiet, or, we try to reason. But, as well, how successful it is to try to reason with a 2-year-old that is just having a big fit. It doesn't work to say, just calm down, right?
So I have 3 teenagers now, so it's a different time, but still, reasoning with them is not easy.
Yeah, but over time we learn to repress. We learn that if I'm getting really mad or having a fit, then mom won't love me, or, they will give me the silent treatment, or they will send me to my room. We learn that who we are, in a certain way is not acceptable. And so we hold back our authentic emotions in order to stay connected to our caregivers, or in order to stay safe, to get love, to get approval, to get acknowledgement. But that becomes, after a while, almost like our personality. And so what we often see as personality, like someone who is introverted or extroverted, isn't really personality that is static. It is a conditioned pattern that we're forced to be in through emotional repression. And that is simply programming in the body, like the hyper-independence that I had was simply, and so that is actually an avoidant attachment. It's simply programming that says, get away from me, I have to be alone. And so I learned in my family of upbringing that I cannot be weak. I have to be strong. I grew up with 3 brothers. I have to be strong, right? And I can never show them that I am vulnerable, because I was already accused of being too sensitive.
They shamed you when you were what they considered to be too sensitive. So that part of you had to push down and get rid of, I guess.
Exactly. That part of me I had to push down. So anger became more available for me, even though I also repressed anger. But I could still show up as powerful, which I did in my previous jobs, right? And I could still be angry. And that is what we have seen. So in the modality that I am working with right now, KI, Emotional Repression Inquiry, that was developed by Scott Killaby and Dan McClintock. We have seen that we can identify whether someone represses either big emotions like anger, power, like emotions and energies like sexuality, or the more vulnerable emotions like hurt and sadness and grief and fear. And our nervous system tends to default to emotions that it has learned to perceive as safer, or it shuts down completely, which is also a safety mechanism. And that disconnection from our authentic emotions and our authentic selves then leads to strained relationships, to a sense of isolation. But for instance, in my case, like repressing hurt and sadness, the anger, if I focus on anger management sometimes, and also with clients that I work with who repress the vulnerable emotions, but then that misses the point. because anger is not problem. It's the repression of hurt that is the problem. It's the missing experience.
So what
Right.
can you do? Like, all right, so I guess, yeah, I don't need to get you to give away everything, but what are a couple ways that you can identify or someone can identify in themselves or maybe in someone else that they get some like strong emotions that are being repressed?
Yeah, good question. So when you can show up with anger in your day-to-day life and you can express anger easily, but it's harder for you to feel and express hurt and sadness, you might actually check if you have hurt and sadness repression. And those people that are more people pleasing and tend to gravitate to always peace and love and kindness and compassion may actually weaponize those emotions unconsciously to stay safe and get love from those, around them.
What do you mean weapon? Like, what would they do? What would this look like to someone that doesn't have this training and just, is experiencing it? What would they see or hear?
From an anger perspective?
Yeah, let's say from someone that they know that's, emotionally repressed and the anger's coming out, or like you said, they weaponize some of these other emotions. What does that look like in an interaction with that person?
Okay, yeah. So someone who represses hurt and sadness would use anger as a tool to control and to not feel those so vulnerable and not express that vulnerability. So for instance, in my case, it's easier to use myself as an example here. I struggled with overt displays of dominance. So, and anger was for me repressed too, but I would distance emotionally, right? I would draw affection to shield myself. I would dominate the narrative. So intelligence can be weaponized with a tendency to intellectualize everything, focus on compiling facts and proof to feel in control, right? So you can use condescension disguised as intellect, right? So masking defensiveness as confidence, using cleverness to maintain control. That is a tool that I often see as well.
Interesting. I don't know. Maybe it's only happened now. They worked with a lot of people, but now when you interact with people, is it as if you wear like different glasses? You can see these things in people that may be hidden to others?
Yeah, and it's actually irrelevant what I see because we have tools where people can detect the contractions in their body that hold the frozen fear, that trap the emotions in their body. And so we have several tools like the reverse inquiry and other tools where people can, through a repression test, can test in their body what emotions they repress and what is their dominant repression. So if you can show up as powerful and use anger in your day-to-day life, then and you still are suffering. So we have it connected emotional repression with all kinds of suffering from even using a safer emotion a lot like anger. Someone has a real anger problem. We have seen very often that we can find coping mechanisms. We can breathe our anger away, look at it with a non-judgmental mindset. Yeah, there's so many things that we can do to control that, but actually we're not looking at the root cause because the root is buried hurt. It's not anger. And so at times that I needed compassion the most, it wasn't available to me. And then I would just slide in a rabbit hole of shame and guilt, right? And regret. We can manage the anger, but often it manifests if it's buried hurt that is at the root of the anger issues. It will manifest as something else because we haven't dealt with the emotional repression with the contractions in the body. It can manifest as compulsions. It can manifest as addiction, as anxiety, ADHD, depression. And we have seen through emotional repression inquiry that those resources, we call them actually resources, dissolve when we dissolve the contractions in the body through repression inquiry.
Well, can you maybe give an example? Is a little bit confusing. Like, what's an example? I don't know, a simple example for people that are listening to do and to check themselves for one of these emotions, or just maybe what'll come to their mind is a situation with somebody they're like, oh, so and so was acting like that. What can you say to people, or what have you said in the past when people go, oh, I get it? Any helpful examples?
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about how situations with my children used to trigger me. And I'm just thinking about a few clients too with children who can, get very irritated and angry when their children mess up, keep their, mess up their house, or when they come home from school and, just throw everything in the hallway and just go to their devices And I would get angry, for instance, if this would happen with my children, what I felt like, what I realized when doing inquiry is that there was a deficiency story that was running the show. Like deficiency stories that often show up is something like they don't care about me or unmet needs. So I don't feel supported when the kids do that, or I don't matter to them, or I'm not important. And then we have seen that this story, and this is what actually most psychological modalities focus on, are those limiting beliefs, those identities, those deficiency stories, shadows. They are just there because it's safer to believe that I don't matter than access the buried anger and hurt of my childhood that I had to bury in frozen fear contractions in my body when I felt I didn't matter, or that I felt ignored, or that I couldn't express myself when needs were unmet when I was a child.
Were you replaying with your own kids? Were you replaying how you were treated, just not as strongly, or like what came from your childhood you believe that you would do with your own children? Like you'd get upset at them if they weren't perfect, or like how do you think it manifested?
Good question. Yeah, I was raised by parents that were very strict and very controlling in ways. And so the way I played this out with my children is doing the exact opposite. I didn't have good boundaries with my children. I basically wanted to let them completely free. And then, of course, they would always cross the line, right? So because in the end, I did have boundaries, but I didn't want to give them because I didn't want to be that strict. But when they would cross it after a while, I felt my anger coming up of not being heard and not being seen as a child, right? And I kept repressing it, and I kept basically building up that pressure like a pressure cooker, and then the lid flew off, right?
Okay.
But that anger wasn't actually, that anger there was only there to protect myself from the hurt that I felt as a child and that I couldn't access. And so when I did emotional repression inquiry, what happened is that those stories fell away. So I'm not getting triggered anymore, and I can just give boundaries from the beginning, and I can communicate clearly to my children what are my needs and what matters to me. And I realized I didn't even do that in the beginning. I didn't set those boundaries. So of course they would break them because I didn't express them in the first place. And what happened with reversing hurt repression is that I'm barely getting triggered. Those stories, believing that I'm not good enough and that my needs don't matter or I'm not important, those have no charge anymore in the body. Those are away. So it's just incredible freedom that has come in its place because we have a communication, and my kids are 12 and the other one is turning 14 next week, and we have a fantastic relationship because we communicate everything together. So
That's really good. So is there a name for this type of therapy that Killaby offers, the Institute, or like what is it called? Is it in combination with CBT or other stuff? Like what is it?
yeah, that's a good question. It's not a therapy. It's a spiritual practice, and it is basically a toolkit, and it's providing very clear, sharp tools and a context and a language to dive underneath those identities, like I'm not good enough, and underneath patterns that create suffering, like anxiety, like depression, even chronic pain. And it makes the unconscious programming that is stuck in the body, because no matter how mindful we can be around anger, when our amygdala is hijacked, when you really are angry, that's when those tools don't really work. So with emotional repression inquiry, we make that unconscious programming conscious by aligning the mind and the body. And that way we reverse emotional repression programs that are stuck in the body, that keep the emotions stuck and trapped in frozen fear, so that we can access, feel, and express what we locked away long time ago. And a beautiful side effect that I've seen before, when I was trained as a psychotherapist, we learned a lot about nervous system regulation. But dissolving emotional repression, what I found is that nervous system regulation is no longer needed, because our emotions are the tools that the nervous system needs to regulate itself. So just as much as depression is not a lack of Prozac, nervous system dysregulation is not a lack of nervous system regulation tools. So even though it helps to take space and to reflect instead of reloading when you feel angry without dealing with the emotional repression that drives the anger, the safer emotion for hurt repressors, that drives disconnection in a relationship. Without going to the emotional repression, we just stay triggered. We just wait for the next trigger to happen, or, different kinds of suffering that show up in life, like chronic pain. Like for me, my autoimmune disease has completely resolved. And I also had this, cornea issues. My cornea was breaking down. And even though from a medical point of view, the ophthalmologist calls it a medical miracle, what I did was emotional repression inquiry. And I found a lot of programming in my eyes that I didn't want to see what was happening, which also explains the amnesia that was happening. And so I didn't want to see. And right now with the tools, I have a perfect vision, and the health issues that I saw have reversed. And I've seen this with clients too, with all kinds of issues, including things like binge eating and depression, anxiety, and chronic pain. My migraines too have completely disappeared with this work.
That's great. Well, I guess you don't have that, struggle within yourself. You're letting out your emotions where you can, and so it's not building up and making you sick, essentially, I guess, in plain English. That's what it seems like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, what I found is that the difference between this work, between somatic inquiry using emotional repression from the Killaby inquiries, the difference I found is that not only do we work with the unconscious, with the stories that are underneath that are driving our conscious behavior, but we also address the programming that is in the body. So we don't only empty the reservoirs of stored emotion. That's what people do with TRE or with somatic experiencing and emotional release. We actually look at the contractions in the body, because what we have buried, what we have repressed, doesn't show up as an emotion. It shows up as a contraction, and we can detect it using emotional repression inquiry. So we have finally found a way how we can get to the root of a lot of our suffering in our lives. And that's why I'm so passionate about it, and why I didn't even pursue anymore my license in psychology, because this is more powerful work than I've ever come across.
So how do people search for it? What do they call it? How do they get it? Where do they go?
Well, you can go to www.killaby.com. So Scott Killaby and Dan McClintock have developed this modality. And so killaby.com is the website where you can go and where you find blog articles, you find research, you find a community. We teach this modality to people through mentorship now. And that's why it's also not a therapy, because we teach people to be self-sufficient. They can use these tools to free themselves whenever they get triggered, whenever they encounter suffering in their life, whether it's through compulsions, addictions, or depression. They can use these tools to free themselves. So it's killaby.com. I can also give you information to put in the bio.
Okay. No, that would be very good. So killaby.com. Okay. So now you're free of sickness and all that. Is there anything missing? I mean, has this completely fixed you in your mind, or are you still struggling with things, or, what percentage of people that get this help still need help? And is there additional tools that are brought in over time, or what does it look like?
Yeah. So when people come to us, we usually start a mentorship track with them, and they learn the tools to meet their own suffering. And so after a while, what is interesting is that I don't even mind when something happens. It just triggers a curiosity right away. Like, hey, what's happening? And I just use the tools to free myself from it. So whenever I'm upset, it's not anymore like, damn, this is not going to change. And what's happening? I'm not angry for long anymore. When something happens, there is immediately this curiosity that comes like, what else is life asking me to look at? And I also found that the more I do this work, the more things fall into place and the less I mind things happening. And that's very freeing.
Yeah, no, that's very good. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have an amazing story, and it's that's really cool that this has helped you and it can help other people. So again, you said the resources. Any stories that come to mind? I know this is very private info, for the clients you work with, but without names, maybe is there a story that comes to mind that just amazed you, with its power and its goodness and a big change someone went to and they're really happy?
Yeah, there are tons of stories. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, is there like one that comes to mind that one of your favorites?
Yeah, I was just thinking of this week there was one client who came to me in September for especially for binge eating, and she has been using these tools since September, since we have been learning together. And she told me just yesterday that her relationship with food has changed entirely over the last 6 weeks, and she has even no urge anymore, nothing. So she really found through this work the anger that she had stored towards her parents, feeling often very helpless as a child. And she has been able to access those contractions in the body and dissolve them. And, you know, I explained to her before that the suffering just disappears, it just dissolves. And it was sometimes really hard to put that into words because it's a truly somatic process. And she was in tears. She was telling me just yesterday that she understands now what I meant, that her, it just dissolved. It's no longer there. She doesn't think about food anymore the same way. And that just, that makes my heart smile the biggest smile. And so those stories, clearing them regularly it just fuels my passion even more.
Okay, well, very good. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and I really appreciate well, I don't know how to, I'm trying to conjugate the word brave into some other form it's not normally used, but thank you for being brave. There we go. That's what I could say. Because you said you were a bit nervous, and, I've done this so many times that I'm not nervous, but guests often are. So I really appreciate you breaking through that and still coming. So thank you for being there.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com